Welcome to Reach for Healing. I'm Rebecca, and I'm in recovery from religious science. And this video, I'm going to talk about the foundations of religious science. In other words, how did it get started? What was going on? And are the legends and the history that are shared today really in alignment with the truth as is available for evaluation in the newspapers and whatnot? So, one of the things that is very interesting about the science of mind movement is that it kind of worships Ernest Holmes. Not in the same way that other religions worship their gods, but Ernest Holmes is venerated as this great philosophical genius. The fact of the matter is, Ernest Holmes was one of many children toward the younger end of the progression of children in rural Maine, in a family in rural Maine. He left his formal schooling at about 8th grade, and he seemed to be a nice enough character. He bounced about in different jobs. He did some studying with people in Christian Science, but he didn't really have a formal education in terms of one that would lead to a career. And he wasn't formally educated in such a way as would require him to read the classics and to debate different perspectives and things like that. His brother Fenwick, older brother Fenwick, however, did have an education, a baccalaureate education, and had gone on to divinity school. And off the top of my head, I can't remember which one, but he had earned a degree in divinity. So we have these brothers, these Holmes brothers, Fenwick and Ernest. There were William was another one. And at some point, Ernest moved out to California, and he worked as the director of parks or something in the one town that he lived in. And at some point in the late 1920s, Fenwick found a really cool way to make money, and he was selling stock options outside of the parameters of what is legal. And he was actually formally charged with securities fraud. In 1930, it made all the newspapers. In fact, if you Google it, you can look on my blog site too. I've written about it there. Forbes.com lists him up there with the likes of Bernie Madoff and some other scammers who were famous in American history. But Fenwick Holmes found out that people in church, especially wealthy women, were very willing to give money to a man with a collar. And he learned that lesson, and he tried to parlay that ability to influence and manipulate into selling these stocks or these inappropriate or illegal securities. And he was charged, and he came very close to being convicted. But he escaped that. And it's my contention, and this is just my belief based on what I've read in the newspapers, all publicly available information compared with what is written about Ernest Holmes in the Science of Mind archives. He had migrated, he being Fenwick, over into divine science, which was an emerging metaphysical movement. Divine science was started by a handful of women, Nona Brooks, Fanny Brooks James, and a number of other women. Melinda Kramer was involved as well. So there were women that were discovering a different way of being connected to the divine. So Fenwick jumps into divine science ministerial training. He calls his younger brother Ernest, who had kind of hopped around between different jobs and careers, didn't really have a serious direction. And he says, Ernest, come on over. And so they go through divine science ministerial school, which was not a college type curriculum. It was kind of like the classes that you'll see in a metaphysical church or center today. But they both went through and they both became ordained as divine science ministers. Now, off the top of my head, I don't have the timeline precisely, but around this time, Fenwick had just gotten off by the skin of his teeth, out from under the securities fraud. And now we have the opportunity to get money out of people, which was what he was trying to do with the securities fraud, but to do it in a way that had a little more distance between the money extraction and the federal government. Securities fraud can get you arrested and thrown in jail pretty quickly. Ask Martha Stewart. And taking money from people under the guise of being a minister or under a religious context is a little trickier because of the constitutional separation of church and state. Now, Fenwick's affiliation with divine science, I believe he was giving lectures to divine science groups, and it's hinted in some of the, I think it's the Forbes.com piece, it's hinted that he had pressured some of his parishioners to invest in this stock scheme. So I suspect that there was pressure in divine science to defrock Fenwick. So Fenwick kind of is persona non grata in divine science. He at least is on the radar of some people for being perhaps not quite above board. But along comes the blemish-free Ernest. Ernest comes into divine science, and as the story is told, Ernest has all these revelations. He writes all these books, and he's now hailed as the great genius of religious science, which is really divine science with a few tweaks here and there. I have no way of knowing if Ernest Holmes was as shifty as Fenwick or not. There is no documentation to suggest one way or the other. In fact, I kind of think Ernest wasn't, I don't think Ernest, based on what I've read, I have no evidence to support that Ernest was sneaky and underhanded. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that Fenwick was. The challenge that I have is that Fenwick had the formal education. Fenwick had been an editor in the school paper in his university. Ernest Holmes was had an eighth grade education. It's very difficult for me to believe that Ernest was the one that penned all those books and wrote all those treatises on metaphysics, otherwise known as religious science. I believe that Fenwick was still very involved, but just behind the scenes, because he had gotten his hand slapped and had that indictment for that charge. He had been, like I said, charged with securities fraud. I think it's much more likely that Fenwick was more involved than anyone wants to give him credit for. And if Ernest went along with that and was above board, there's no harm, no foul. I'm not suggesting that Ernest Holmes did anything illegal. I do think he passed off books as his that were likely written by Fenwick. I'm also disturbed that they seem to really just wholesale take everything that Nona Brooks and her compadres had put together, attended their school, and then left and started their own movement. Doesn't seem to be very above board and spiritual, if you will. But that appears to be what they did. And so when you look at the science of mind movement, you have to ask yourself a number of things. Why did two men feel compelled to steal the work that was done primarily by a group of women, give it a new name, and basically pass it off as their original thinking? That's a fair question, number one. Number two, how much of Fenwick's realization that there was money to be had from being a minister and extracting that money from parishioners, especially female parishioners, how much of that went into the motivation to steal from divine science and build religious science? Fair question, given Fenwick's documented historical shenanigans. The other question that I have, and this in and of itself is probably worth a couple videos. Ernest Holmes talks about Emerson being this great influencer of his, but he's very clearly not read all of Emerson. Emerson, indeed, in his early writings, Self Reliance and Nature, talks about this concept of being one with the divine and the creative thought and all those things. However, real scholars who read the classics, true scholars who read the classics, keep reading and realize that down the road, Emerson walked back almost all, all of those propositions that he had laid out in his early writings. In fact, he says in I forget the name of the writing, but toward the end of his career and end of his life, he wrote that at the end of the day, there's a lot of life that's just left up to fate. He surrenders to the idea that fate has more to do with our experience in life than all of that. Put your attention on things and the way that Emerson talked about, self-reliance and nature and a lot of the foundational things that ended up being what Ernest Holmes relied on for a lot of his work, or I'll say Fenwick and Ernest, since I do think that they continued to have a partnership for many years. So we have a movement built on partial facts, not all of Emerson's writing, just picking and choosing. We've got a movement built on material that was stolen from a female-owned, female-started, female-dominated religious group after two men were invited into that group to train. We have documented, this isn't my interpretation, I've read it in the historical documentation, that Fenwick realized that there was money to be had in the church business. And not long after that, he and his brother, who doesn't have the tainted name that Fenwick has, coming into divine science. And it all kind of comes together. It all comes together to form an early foundation where there really should be some healthy skepticism around the veracity of the claims, around the true motivation for the establishment of the religion. And it should bother thinking people. It should bother thinking people who are serious of heart and truly want to use science of mind teachings to serve others. It should bother those people that these foundations are kind of glossed over and not addressed and blatantly ignored. That, it bothers me. And it's something that the more I read about and the more I dug into, the more frustrated I got with a movement that purports to want to help make a world that works for everyone, but that is built upon some very questionable foundations. Now, before anybody says, don't you have forgiveness in your heart? Sure. I think everyone is worthy of forgiveness. But you can't forgive someone if you're covering up the story, which is what has been done to a great extent on the early foundations of religious science and science of life. And so for me, it's hard to, in 2022, it's hard for me to take any of the teachings that come out of the textbook that is allegedly what Ernest Holmes wrote. Again, I think that Fenwick was the writer, not Ernest. It's hard to take those things seriously as a guide for life. Was their motivation truly serving others, or was it a realization that that they could make a really good living by promising people things? Promising people things and pointing to Emerson's teaching as proof, when the most charitable assessment of this is they didn't read all of Emerson. My suspicion is they decided, after reading most of Emerson, to only go with the parts that supported and provided a foundation to what they wanted to do, which was to convince people that they had a secret they could teach people and people would give them money to do In another video, I'll talk about what happens to us psychologically when we do some of the things that we're taught in organized spiritual metaphysics, changing the way we think about things. It's called cognitive behavioral therapy, and it's a technique that therapists have been using for decades to help people who are suffering emotionally, mentally, to help them rewire their brains. So, this isn't some great revelation that Ernest Holmes came to. This is something that has been developing up out of psychology for decades. There's also a lot of things that happen in our brains, in terms of neuroscience, when we decide to put our attention on something. And a great example is a new car. So when we decide that we're going to buy a new car and we think about a certain kind of car, maybe it's a bit different than the kind of cars we've purchased in the past, very new to us. As soon as we put our attention on that car, what happens is we begin to see that car everywhere. And that's not magic. We didn't manifest it. What happens is the neurofiltering in our brains reset itself so that we pick that car out of all the noise around us. We'll talk more about neurofiltering. We'll talk more about CBT. We'll talk more about the foundations of this movement known as science of mind. But if you're curious about anything I've said, I encourage you to Google Fenwick Holmes and read about his early foundations. And just think about what that might mean to the story that is religious science. Until next time, take care.